and from 2006 until 2015, he worked for Northeast Auctions in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He has worked closely with the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia, and also the Jefferson County Museum in Charlestown. So I introduce and present to you Mr. John C. Newcomer.
You don't have to stand if you don't want to.
I'm going to answer the two questions I most often ask. The first is whether you're crippled, and I'm crippled because I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed 11 years ago with last fall. And the other thing is that people want to look at the next I ask about the next time. That was from the gift shop at the York County Historical Society when I lived in York, Pennsylvania. It was designed by someone that worked for them. So I'm going to now sit, I'll use the microphone and talk about the family. And all these pages. Can you folks hear? Can you folks hear?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, now I want to thank Ann Reeler so much for the introduction, and I had a lovely visit with her when they had the Historic College Association meeting, and they're trying to reform a board for Historic College, and my sister and I both went to the meeting, and that's where I met Ann Reeler. And I need to tell you briefly that before Grandfather Brackett came as an educator and founder of the college, he worked for the last year of the Civil War with the Christian Commission. And that was the forerunner of the American Red Cross. And his job, he was assigned to Sheridan's army. He was a Union general. Sheridan spent his last year in the Shenandoah Valley. And what Grandfather did was all of the errands for both Confederate and Union soldiers that were involved in the battles. He had to clean up the battlefields, get all the wounded taken in, and one of the last battles that he worked on was right near Winchester. I forget the name of the battle, but it was a point sort of outside of Winchester.
Cedar Creek, the Battle of Cedar Creek.
Cedar Creek. And 2 days after the Battle of Cedar Creek, Grandfather Brackett was cleaning up the battlefield, and he found a live Confederate soldier. And he got him into Winchester, and the man lived. Well, it was a blessing that he lived, because after Grandfather was working on the education system and on Historic College, he was in Charlestown on business one day, and he was attacked, which happened regularly, by a group of whites who hated him and called him names, and they were beating him up. They pulled him off his horse. And this young man appeared, and he said, "Don't you touch a hair on that man's head. He saved my life on the battlefield at Cedar Creek." And it was the young Confederate officer that Grandfather saved who saved his life in return in Charlestown. And I didn't understand. I was lucky. My grandmother, Newcomer, Celeste Brackett Newcomer, lived with us from, I think, 1845 until her death in 51. And she used to tell stories. And one of the stories I most remember is that she said that as children they couldn't go outside and play in Harper's Ferry. They were so hated. And the teachers would get attacked, particularly trying to walk to the classrooms, and they almost had to have escorts with them. So my grandmother Celeste and her next younger sister Mary and their two brothers who were James and LeDrew couldn't go outside and play. So from the time grandmother was 9 years old on, she was in charge of getting her younger sister and two brothers to Maine. And they went to Old Orchard, Maine in the summer so they could go out and play and swim in the surf. And that was the Free Will Baptist Church colony. And most of the summer resorts in the entire United States, whether you go to Rehoboth, Delaware, wherever, were started by religious groups. And they would have summer meeting places where they could go and enjoy the surf and the swimming and play and have the sand and so forth. And the McDonald's cottage, I went to visit personally the last summer that Mrs. McDonald was alive. That's Henry McDonald's wife, widow. And we went to Old Orchard to visit her, and her two daughters were there visiting also. So we spent time, my cousin Miriam from Phillips, Maine, my Aunt Louise, who was my father's sister, and myself, visited with Mrs. McDonald in the McDonald cottage. And she said, "Have you ever been to the Bracket cottage?" And I said, "No, where is it?" And the McDonald cottage was right on the sand. I mean, you just straight out the beach and the water started, and it was not more than 200 feet back. The Bracket cottage was back on the main street in Old Orchard. And we went back and saw that, and it was still standing. And it was very recognizable because my grandfather Brackett had his 75th birthday party there, and the whole family came. And there were lots of pictures that were taken of him on the porch with the family around him at his 75th birthday party. And it was very distinctive because the porch around the edge had cutouts of stars and shooting stars and moons on the fascia board around the porch. And it was still there, and all of those houses have just changed hands. And I went to visit Dr. McDonald's daughter, Buff McDonald, the older daughter, at the age of 102, and she spent her summers still in Maine, her winters in Florida, and lived with her daughter. And she didn't die until 109, just a year ago, June. 109, so I saw her at 102. The first thing she did when I walked into the living room, and I hadn't seen her in 25 or 30 years, I'd seen her at her mother's funeral. And she stood up and she said, "I can still touch my toes." And at 102, she bent over and touched her toes. And I remember my father, when he got in the hospital in 91, came home and said, "I wonder if I can still touch my toes." He bent over and touched his toes. My cousin Betty, who just died a couple of years ago, who was my aunt's only daughter, but oldest daughter died at 87. When she was 85, she showed me that she could touch her toes. It was apparently a thing in Harper's Ferry, showing that you were well, that you bent over and touched your toes. I never had heard of that anyplace else, but they all did. So anyway, so that was interesting, and I used to love to hear the stories. My grandmother would actually tell me the stories about how she would take her sister and her two younger brothers to Maine. And she started when she was 9 years old. And you know, there's 9 down to 4 or 5. And they would get on the train, my grandmother and grandfather, it's long before marriage, my great-grandmother would take them down to the station in Harper's Ferry. They'd get on the train, and the 4 kids would go into Washington on the train. They would then, at the station in Washington, change trains and go to New York. In New York, and she had all this written down, my grandmother did, Celeste at 9, they would have to change stations, and they went to another station, and from the next station they caught the train to Boston. In Boston, they had to get onto the narrow gauge railroad to go up to Old Orchard, because from Boston north, it was narrow gauge railroads. And so you had the narrow gauge, and they had to get on that, and then they, family, friends, my relatives from Phillips, Maine would meet them. So anyway, all right, now I want to tell you a bit about the Bracketts and how they got to this country. They came from England in 1632, which was 12 years after the Pilgrims and 13 years after the first slaves arrived in Hampton. So they were quite early. I would say that they missed the first couple boats, but they came in 1632. So they came from England to Massachusetts. Our branch of the family moved from Massachusetts. They ended up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, sometime in the 18th century. and they're still at Bracket Road. And when I started working in Portsmouth, I was driving around one day looking at the town and surroundings, and it was Bracket Road. And I started asking, they said, oh, that's where the Bracket family used to live. And then I knew there were Brackets in Portland, and our branch of the family, and then of course by this time there are many branches, moved to Portland, Maine. And from Portland, Maine in 1807, our branch moved to Phillips, Maine, which is in western Maine near the Rangeley Lakes. And we had family there through 1975, and my aunt, my father's sister, Aunt Louise, and I used to go up and visit, and we went every summer for several years when I was first in college. And after that, I continued going back 3 times a year, and I would stay with cousin Miriam Brackett, who was James Brackett's daughter. And she was Miriam Brackett Trecarton. Her husband was a Trecarton. And for years, the family lived there, and they were all running the local drugstore, and they always made sure that the town had everything it needed. And I remember when the town needed a restaurant, my cousin Miriam said, I'm going to build a building and see if we can't get somebody to open a little restaurant in Phillips, because there's no place to eat without driving 20 miles to Farmington. And she would do that. And I remember that the lady doctor had come from Germany, and I said, how did you end up with a German doctor with such a heavy accent in Phillips, Maine? And Miriam said, well, I found her, and I looked her up, and I got her to come here, and I had to guarantee her salary. So Miriam said to me one day, she said, you know, if you don't participate and take part in the community falls apart. And I remember we were leaving Maine. It was the 21st or 22nd of December. We were trying to get ready to bring Miriam. We'd driven up and it was snowing. And we were driving Miriam down to Harper's Ferry for the holidays. And she said, I've got to stay and cut greens with the girls. The girls were with the ladies her age from church, because she said we're having our green sale. And she said, if I'm not here to help them cut greens, she said, I'm not participating, I have to do that. She said, always remember this, participate and keep your communities going, otherwise you don't have a community. And so I remember learning that from Miriam, and Miriam moved down to live with us in 1975, and she moved down in August, and she died between Christmas and New Year's that year. And that was the last of our family in Maine. So I knew where she used to take us and show us where the farm had been originally, and that had burned. And she had bought another farmhouse that she thought was similar, restored it. And every auction, which were very popular back then, she would go and buy anything that was Bracket furniture, and she had the entire house furnished with things that she had found out had descended in the Bracket family. The one thing which had never been out of the Bracket family that she gave me was the trunk that they used in the covered wagon when they moved from Portland to Phillips, and I still have that in my house, and I've got to decide where to give that. All right, now just to fill in a couple of blanks, all of our family papers, and there were thousands, I read all of Dr. Brackett's papers, and we had tons of other artifacts from Stewart College and from the family. We gave them, we debated for ages what to do with them, and we went up, grandfather graduated from Dartmouth, we went up and talked with them, and Dartmouth said, well, you really ought to keep them closer to home in case people come to Harper's Ferry and want to know about Stewart College. They should be close by. And so we talked to the museum in Charlestown, we talked to the Park Service. We ended up giving them to the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, which is in Winchester. And my grandfather founded churches as far south as Stanton. And so the extent, the most amazing thing that ever happened was when I went to the Loudoun County, Virginia Historical Society meeting one time. And they had their meetings in Lovettsville in the church on the main street. I went there for one of their meetings. I was told I'd be interested. It was all people who had graduated from Stewart College who became teachers in Loudoun County, Virginia. There were 50-some. They put pictures on the screen and talked about them, and they had pictures of almost all 50-some. But when you think about how far-reaching that college was, when you think about both the missionary type work that was done, but also the learning and the places that the people ended up teaching, it was unbelievable. I mean, the total number of students was just 2,000 or 3,000, but it was just amazing how far that number of people reached. Now, I wanted to talk about my first awareness of the Morrell family. And I had heard the name, and we pronounced it Morrell. We pronounced it Morrell rather than Morrell. Morrell family. And I remember I went to Harper's Ferry Elementary School, which Park Service owns, and it was originally the Restoration Labs when they first bought it. Now it's sitting empty, but they promised they're going to restore it. Anyway, I was out on the playground right behind the school, and the Baptist church, the Historic College church, is right there. And so it was 1953, and I was on the playground, the upper part of the playground. I saw this big fancy car, fancy to me, four-door car pull up, and this man gets out, obviously the chauffeur, and he opens the door, and this lady gets out of the back. And I was in the third grade, and I thought, oh, that looks like a movie star. And in my mind, it was still a Brackett. So then they open the trunk and get out a floral wreath. And the lady takes the floral wreath and walks over to the marker in front of the church and puts it on Dr. Morrell's marker. Well, Park Service finally got so curious, they couldn't find out where Dr. Morrell was buried. They finally x-rayed and found out, but I knew as a kid, because my mother and father said, number one, they said it was not the little Brackett, it was Betty Davis. And they said, number two, that was she was putting the wreath in Dr. Morrell's grave because that's where he's buried. Well, Park Service finally x-rayed, and there's a whole chapter in the book where they tell about that, and they think there's a body there, and I guarantee you there is. And there's a lovely mark. And so Betty Davis is the granddaughter of Dr. Morrell. And that's why, so in my mind, I got confused which movie star was there, but it was Betty Davis, and she's the granddaughter of Dr. Morrell. And I wanted to show you, I wanted to show you this book. This book is so fabulous. I don't know whether you're aware of the book that came out. They did when Bonnie Roper did the 150th anniversary of Historic College. She did the most fabulous 3-day celebration 2 years ago last fall. 2 years ago this fall. And it was unbelievable. But one of the things that came out was this lovely book. It's called Emancipate the Mind and Soul, which is what's on the window at Historic College. And the book has chapters on every single person that was primarily involved with the college. They sell the book at the bookstore in Harper's Ferry, the National Park Service bookstore, and it is just incredible. It has an entire chapter, and grandfather has an entire chapter in Dr. Morrell, and all the different things that are involved with Historic College. And it's absolutely an amazing book. And I have read this book cover to cover twice now, and I'm going to do it a third time because my mind's slipping. The other thing that is just amazing is to think how far thinking people were in those days. I mean, to imagine that they could think about things like my grandmother, Brackett, was so concerned about the fact that people didn't know about slavery. And this man who had been a slave, one of the Washington family slaves, and there were all the Washington family had slaves, as did most of the rich founding fathers. John Hill was a slave, born into slavery. He was owned by Mrs. Alexander, who was Alexander Washington Cook, the insurance company, but the Alexanders and Washingtons all related. John Hill was taken during the Civil War back to Maine and went to school and came back to Harper's Ferry after the Civil War, a lawyer. And so my grandmother, Brackett, asked him 4 times to please write a letter and explain what had happened to him. And so he starts his letter, which he did finally write. He says, Mrs. Brackett, dear madam, modesty has withheld me this long from complying with your request as to my early life. Just where to begin I am somewhat at a loss, but I will write you an outline and you can take your pick. And twice he says, do not mention the Washington or Alexander names. Well, all of a sudden my Aunt Louise died and a copy of this letter showed up fairly recently. So my cousin Lisa, who is a first cousin once removed, came down from Philadelphia and brought this fabulous copy of the letter. And it was written to Grandmother Brackett, and then another paragraph at the end to Dr. Brackett, telling him to make sure that Mrs. Brackett didn't mention the Alexander or Washington names when she was talking about the slavery. Well, forget that, because We took the letter right into the Jefferson County Museum, and Jane Rissler is the director, and she has basically volunteered to be the director. She's incredible. She's done an amazing job. If you've not seen the museum recently, it is worth seeing. She's done incredible things with it. But she couldn't believe the letter. She got so excited. She said, "Where is the original letter now?" Because this is obviously a copy. It was, photostat. And so we started checking around and found out that the family years ago had given it to Howard University. And so the original is there, and all of a sudden one of the Washington cousin shows up from Washington State, and her name is Sarah Washington Brown, and she is writing a book on the slaves of the Washington family. And she got so excited she could hardly stand. She came into the museum, and we went back and met with her. She called Howard University and got permission to print it. So the Historical Society booklet, Jefferson County Historical Society, in the fall of 2016, printed the entire letter from John Hill. And he was half white, no surprise, and it tells about how his life came about, how he was a slave at Bel Air, which is now a subdivision, which is where Colonel Lewis Washington lived, and then he was given to Mrs. Alexander, who married into the family. He tells in this letter that there was one of the children who looked more like George Washington than anybody else in the Washington family. So you find this out, and then you see the picture of John Hill, which is in here, and he came back a lawyer, and I know you can't see from where you are, but John Hill's picture is in here, and he was a slave who belonged to the Alexanders, came back a lawyer, and actually they made him take another test before he could practice law in West Virginia, and he passed it. But he actually got a job in Berryville, which blew me away because I thought Berryville was worse than Charleston. And I remember growing up, I don't know what your experiences were, but I remember growing up that you couldn't talk about slavery in Berryville or Winchester. And Winchester, I know my father told me, he said, "Don't worry about if you ever have any friends in Winchester, don't worry, they will never invite any of us to anything in Winchester." And I found that out even at the Apple Blossom Festival. And I worked so hard for years on the Apple Blossom, and he was chairman of the Harper's Ferry Bolivar Float Committee, all those things that I got to know all these people. Never, ever did Winchester or Berryville want to be your best friend. I mean, they want to know you. And I found out very early on, in first grade I came home crying one day, and my parents went back to Harper's Ferry Elementary School with me the next morning. Of course, being bushy parents, went back the next morning and said, Mary Howell was my teacher, said, "Why was Johnny crying?" She said, "Well, the kids were teasing him and calling him names," and of course the name was, and my cousin had been called that, and my Aunt Louise's daughter, and so that was what happened. But one of the most amazing stories, true stories, that I ever remember hearing about Harper's Ferry was in the late 60s, a couple moved from Washington, and the husband worked at the Pentagon and had been military, and the wife said, "Well, let's move to Harper's Ferry. I don't need to work any longer. We'll raise our family." They had one kid. They moved to Harper's Ferry, had their second kid, and she volunteered with what used to be called the United Givers Fund, now the United Way. And maybe it's different again now, but anyway, United Givers Fund back then. And you went and you knocked on doors, and you asked for donations for the United Givers Fund. And her husband came home every night on the train, and he came home one night, and Linda said, "I've had the strangest experiences in Harper's Ferry and Bolivar." And he said, "What's that?" And she said, "We know I volunteered for the United Givers Fund." And she said, "I go to the black homes, and they're so educated, and they all have books and libraries, and they have musical instruments, and they always invite me in, they have conversations, they always give me money." She said, all the white people live on the side streets and tell me to get off their front porch," and she said, "They won't give me any money and never invite me in." And she said, "You look at the town." And so I remember Linda Rago told that story. And I started looking at the town, and I remembered that wonderful doctor who was historic college for years on Main Street, and then there's another doctor who's on Back Street. And we had all these friends we'd go visit after church on Sunday, And it was just amazing, the difference in the town. And, I remember crying when Ann and I were 5 and 6. We played with Georgia and Shelby Wilson, and we went up the Wilsons all the time. And I remember they couldn't go to school with us, and we were crying because we couldn't understand why they couldn't go to school with us. And Mother said, well, they have a separate school, and they're black, and they have to go to their school over, I just lost the name, but not Grandview, but anyway, the other school on Harbor Street. And so when we almost never got to see Shelby and Georgia Wilson anymore. And it was very interesting how that all was sort of in reverse. I remember that all the people we went to see were professors at the college, and we went to visit with them, and it was just very interesting, very interesting. All right, now I can't remember what else. I talked about Dr. Morrell, about his daughter, and I get so confused here. One of the other things I want to tell you was that nobody in the family ever figured this out before, but I sat and counted one day. There are actually 10 members of our family that were directly involved with Storer College. It started with grandmother and grandfather Brackett when they came here. Grandmother came in December, and they lived in Lockwood House next to the cemetery, which had been bombed and cannonballs had gone through, and they had to do the best they could, and they started their first school there. There's actually had been a school there, and they lived in part of that. And so, that was very interesting to know. But then along, right after him, came Grandfather Brackett's 2 younger sisters. They were twin sisters. And he was told he was 7 years old, and they said, would you name them? And he named them Laura and Laura. Laura and Laura Brackett. They were twin sisters. They both came to teach. Aunt Lou, Laura, stayed and was married and became Dean of Women at Storer College, but both of them taught there. Then the Bracketts had 2 daughters, Mary and Celeste, my grandmother, my Aunt Mary, who both taught at the college. Then Aunt Mary married Thomas Robertson, who lived in Washington, and Thomas Robertson became a member of the board of directors for years. He was the first commissioner of patents, appointed by, I think, Hoover. And so they were always up here, and Aunt Mary and I had the same birthday, so we celebrated our birthdays together. And then Father, who replaced his father, my grandmother, Celeste Brackett, married John Newcomer. They met at Hillsdale College, and he came back, and he was both a minister and teacher, and grandmother was a teacher. And then Aunt Mary taught for years, and then Father was on the board of directors. And then after that, they once closed in '55, Mother, and I remember as a little kid, I'd never listened carefully to my parents other than when they were punishing me. My mother said, John, she said, your family started this school, and your family had better be responsible for seeing that it's properly closed. And she said, I won't be the business manager until it's completely merged with Alderson, Broadus, and Virginia Union. But all the assets had to be disposed of, and she continued renting the house, and Johnny Hilton stayed on, and he was caretaker of the real estate. Father and my brother Tom and I would go down periodically to close up windows when they'd break them. And I remember when we rented Cook Hall, finally we rented that. Both the Parksers rented part of it, and then Mrs. Fairbairn, Charlotte Fairbairn, rented part of it with her 2 sons. And I remember all those things happening, and I remember the auction sales. I remember that the library was 2 days of auctions to the leftover books. Books were given to those 2 colleges, to West Virginia University, to Berkshires, and to Shepherd. Then all the books that were left over, and there were lots, it took 2 days to sell them, were auctioned. And then the auction for all of the other property from the different buildings, and there were many buildings, I think 11 at that point. They were all sold at auction, and I remember that, and I think I was 12 or 13 by then. And well, it went through 59, because I remember during the John Brown Centennial, they had an antique show in Anthony Hall, and John Brown Centennial was 59. So, and Mother was chairman of that. So there were so many things that were happening. It was just such a fascinating time, but also very traumatic. I remember all the time we were growing up, we used to, when we were little kids, we used to go to things at Storer. There were always speakers, and there were music programs, and we guys used to watch the football games out in the front yard. And it was just such a part, you just got so used to it. And my sister spent her first 4 Christmases in the original Cliffside, which was Lou Leitner, Scott Leitner's house on the campus. And then I spent my first 3 Christmases there, and we found photographs of us in the hallway at Cliffside on the campus, the big Christmas trees out in front of the door that went out onto the balcony above the river. And it was just, you know, it turns out we were the last ones that ever lived on the campus. Yeah. I mean, in the housing. I mean, there were still a few students left that lived in dormitories, but we were the last of the students that lived on the campus. So it was amazing growing up, and a really fascinating life. And to think how important that was to so many people. And Mr. Roper's there, one of the 20-some graduates left. And so, yeah. Just, it's amazing the effect that it's had on the whole area and on the local culture. I mean, it's just, yeah, we were just blessed to have it. So those are my memories. So any questions? Yeah. Thank you. Anne's responsible for this. She's the one who came and asked me. Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
I'd like to ask a question. Did your grandmother ever mention about the organizations, the churches that he helped start?
Yes. Yeah, there were actually, I think, 120 some. And they're listed, but we found out a number through the Library of Congress. And the first, I was aware of how far, we had a program at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, and there were only 90-some people. I mean, that was a good turnout. But there was a group there from a Baptist church in Winchester, and they came up afterwards and said, did you know that your grandfather was one of the founders of our church? And so after that, we kept running into different places. It was just absolutely amazing when you found out. And the other thing that we found in my cousin's, when she's finding all these letters, that she's been going through papers for years. It turns out the family didn't throw anything away. We gave 3,000 and some feet, that's how they phrase papers, Bracket papers to the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. 3,000 some feet, they measured the shelves. And so fortunately they didn't throw anything away, and it was just amazing what we did learn and what we found out, and I got sidetracked, but anyway,
Over what time frame did they work with the churches and schools and so on?
Dr. Morrell and grandfather started pretty soon. And what he decided was that you weren't going to have a school running properly, lasting only if you didn't have a church nearby.
Wow.
And so with almost every school they got going, they founded a church in Shepherdstown, Martinsburg, Charlestown. And they were very good about that. And they had almost all of the schools, which, you know, he was Commissioner of Education for the Freedmen's Bureau. And I didn't tell you about the connection with Howard. Oliver Owen Howard was also from Maine. It was also Freeman Baptist, and he was made head of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so grandfather was the one who suggested to him that he should found a college, start a college, and Howard University as a result. So that is why that letter, that slave letter ended up at Howard University. We've always had a deep appreciation for that university. And so whether Aunt Mary or grandmother, we don't know who gave the original letter, but they kept a copy, and it was so amazing what they kept copies of. They kept copies of things, anything they thought was controversial, that showed a bad light on anybody. Aunt Mary and my grandmother went through the papers, spent years going through the papers, and they would cross out and they would make copies without the negative things in it. And they got so mad, I remember in 1906 when the Niagara movement came and stayed at Storer College. They stayed at Storer College, and the Storer College students, do you know about this, Ann? The Storer College students had to wait on them and take care of their rooms. In the letters, grandmother and grandfather were told that they had to stay in their house with their curtains closed, that they couldn't come to the meetings. So they had hired an agricultural professor who was head of the agriculture department, who graduated from Storer. He'd come back, he's head of the agriculture department. And they asked him if he would see if he could go to the meetings. Well, what was said at those meetings? They were perfectly nasty to the Storer students, perfectly nasty to the professor, Yeah, yeah.
Really?
And, yeah, they made fun of their clothes and, I mean, just everything. It was so, Aunt Mary and my grandmother had taken all the negative things out of all those letters from the students and from the Niagara Movement people, so that it wouldn't be known that there was such dissension between the groups. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I remember, one of the things I remember that I learned from Father's sister, Aunt Louise, I remember Mrs. Dyson used to always be involved. She was on the board and she used to be at all the meetings. And I remember commenting one time on what gorgeous clothes Mrs. Dyson had. I said, she's almost got these beautiful suits, and this one weekend she'd come for a board meeting. They all sit at Cliffside when they come for the board meeting. And so she had this gorgeous bright green, it was yellow-green suit on, ball suit. She had the hat with the big feathers. They were pheasant feathers. And I said, she has gorgeous, gorgeous clothes and gorgeous hat. And my Aunt Louise said, I need to explain something to you. And this is exactly what she said. She said, what you have to remember is, she said, we have been so awful for so many generations to the black people that came as slaves. And she said they don't get their choice of which neighborhoods they want to live in. They don't get their choice of which clubs they join. They're told they can't eat in restaurants. They're told they can't stay in motels. She said, what you have to remember is that the only things they can do are spend their money in clothes and spend their money in cars and spend their money in their houses, but they can't move into most neighborhoods. And I watched that, and I remember one of the most amazing things, I should have thought of this right, that happened was when I was at Michigan State. I started in 62, fall of 62. Is that right? Yeah. When I was at Michigan State, my mother said, she and father both graduated from Michigan State, said you will love Water Carnival, which was put on spring term. It was almost in the spring, and it was Parents' Weekend. And it ran for 2 days, and it was big. When I started Michigan State, the student body was 46,000 plus. So it was unbelievable. I mean, it was, yeah, mind-boggling. So when I was a sophomore, I was able to apply to be on the Water Carnival committee. So I looked over and I thought, well, I'd love to write and direct that. That would be exciting because you had stages over the water, you float. So I applied and I got the chairmanship of Theme and Continuity. Well, one of the things that Water Carnival did was they had a group of 12 judges, 6 Friday night and 6 Saturday night, and then they gave out the prizes on Saturday night. And they said the committee, the Water Carnival committee, has to take them to dinner and entertain them. So you're going to be assigned a judge each night to take to dinner. And well arranged, we'll make the reservations. Anyway, we went to Tarpoff's in downtown Lansing, Michigan. And I was assigned this lady named Gladys Holmes Anderson. And so I'm visiting with her, and she said, now tell me your name again. I said, John Newcomer. She said, and where are you from? I said, Harper's Ferry. She said, are you related to Celeste Newcomer? And I said, yes, that's my grandmother. And she said, well, she said, I used to be on the board of Stewart College, and I almost stayed at your grandmother's when I came for a board meeting. Wow. She was Gladys Holmes Anderson, the daughter of R.E. Holmes of Oldsmobile, and she'd been on the board of Stewart College for 12 or 15 years, and she used to stay at Granny's house. And so it turned out that she knew our family. So, I mean, that was just an interesting thing when you think of being in Lansing, Michigan, and have that happen. So, yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, there are some pictures I was able to borrow from the National Park Service if you'd like to see what Dr. Nathan Brackett and Dr. Alexander Morrell look like. They're on the table up here.
Good. There are also nice pictures in this book that was produced if you have a chance. And I really recommend that if you have a chance, you should get this book. It's called Stewart College, To Emancipate the Mind and Soul. And it really is very concise, easy reading, and very informative. I mean, it's really good, really good. So, yeah. All right, any other questions?
Any other question?
I don't have a question. I don't have a question, but since you mentioned Maryville, our student, WTV Reeves, played basketball over there at Stewart College.
Right, okay. You know the great story of the basketball, the barn that was converted for the gym of Stewart College. Yeah, I mean, that was just unbelievable. They turned that barn into a gym, and it was so small and so tight. And I forget who it was. It was Gwenny Roper.
Yeah.
Do you remember who it was, Mr. Roper, that scored so many points, baskets?
It probably was him.
I think it was wasn't it a lady?
It was a lady.
It was a lady, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
My wife played basketball in that barn.
This gentleman was one of the 4 graduates of Stewart College that spoke at the memorials. Yes. I'm sorry?
Yes, Mr. Roper was one of the,
Yeah.
oral history.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's when
yes.
the 150th.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah.
Another question.
I was surprised to learn when my father's lady friend died a year and a half ago, that she had graduated from Stewart College. She had never mentioned it, and I've been pastoring here at that time 36 years.
She never mentioned
And he never mentioned it, and her name was Eleanor. I don't know what her maiden name was, but when she passed, it was Eleanor Winston. And she graduated from Store, I think it was 51, 52, around in there somewhere. But I was just so amazed. I'm sitting there reading the eulogy and having been pastored here, and I'm thinking, oh my God, in all these years, knowing her, and she graduated from this historic college right here, just minutes away from where I pastored.
Amazing. That is amazing, yeah. I know what I started to tell earlier, got sidetracked, was that I got to reread my grandmother's obituary when we were sorting papers for my aunt's estate. My cousin from Philadelphia was helping. And my grandmother's obituary, first thing that was amazing was that the pallbearers were still my father's best friends by the time he died in '92, and he had the same best friends that had been the pallbearers at my grandmother's funeral. But in the obituary, it said that she was a philanthropist. And I thought, how could you be a philanthropist without any money? And it just amazed me. I mean, she had $10,000 some dollars that she'd been living on for years. Well, it turned out that what she did, I mean, one of the last things she did, she bought the building that is now the Harpers Ferry Women's Club, and she gave the Women's Club, if they'd started a Women's Club, she gave them that building right on the main street in Harpers Ferry, across from Dr. Johnson's house. And she also gave them a bookcase, and she said, I will give you this if you promise to maintain a library, because there's no library in Jefferson County. She said, we've got to have a library in Harpers Ferry. So she gave them this oak bookcase and gave them all the books that she could get rid of, and they donated other books. And that was going to be sold in 1991 or 2. And Linda Rago said to him, she'd been president of the Women's Club, she said, you can never sell that bookcase because Mrs. Newcomer gave us that bookcase and we have to keep it filled with books that are loaned. And so anybody that comes or goes from that building can take a book and leave a book. And just, yeah. So that has been maintained. So that was one of her philanthropies, I just said. So yeah. Okay. All right. And anybody else? Again, I want to thank Ann. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we thank you so
Okay,
much.
all right. We're not going to take bets until I can get back to the car.
Oh, and we just have a little something
Oh,
we
you didn't
got
have
for
to do
you.
that. You know.
We have one of our Bracket-Morrell Association shirts
Oh, my God.
and our yearbook from this year with all the churches that are in the Bracket-Morrell and pictures and everything. So that's for
Great, well,
you.
thank you so much.
You are so very welcome.
I'm so glad to learn about this organization, because before the meeting, and when Ann told me, I was unaware of the organization. I mean, I knew the grandfather had been involved, and I knew Dr. Morrell had been involved, but I didn't know. Yeah, good, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Would you like to stay? Do you want to stay and have dinner with us? Would you like to stay and have dinner? You sure can.
Please
If
do.
you have time.
Please do.
Time.
And this,
So then you know,
Yes, yes.
it's Faye Morgan. Faye Morgan, I'll work together down.
Yes. Faye was with us.
Yes, she was.
Usually she pay you.
Yeah,
I go.
yeah. And Faye's on oxygen now. She's on oxygen. Small world. Faye often talked about oxygen all the time.
We're
And Faye's
gonna get ready to go to lunch. But first, Dr. Martin would like to say something to us.
Okay. I would just say thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for allowing me to be here with you today. I've really enjoyed myself. I've learned a lot, and look forward to seeing you again, either in April or again in August of. Well, I've already been told I'm preaching in August of 2020, so I got voluntold. But I just enjoyed myself, and I'll be praying for you and your churches, and that God bless each and every one of you again. Thank you. I hate that I won't be able to eat dinner with you because I got to get to Baltimore to catch this plane. But again, I want to thank you for your hospitality, and I enjoyed being here with you these 2 days.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're going to get ready to.
and you have added a tremendous part of the history of all of our churches. And, you know, it's forever recorded.
Good. Amen.
Yes. Good. Because I found back there, I know 4 churches in Piedmont area.
Yes.
And I have to go to one of those churches.
Yeah. Yeah. And the second and third churches that was started in 1868, Wainwright and St. Luke are here. Yeah, are here today.
We just celebrated our 150th
Yeah,
anniversary.
we just celebrated our 150th. Yeah, both of us. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, Reverend Jackson, since you standing up, you volunteered to bless the foods.
Let me make sure there was.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
okay.